Hello, thank you for clicking on the Literacy Volunteers of Harrison County YouTube channel. We're a nonprofit United Way agency, and we would love for you to like, share our videos, and subscribe. If you want to subscribe, just hit subscribe below and click the bell icon, and you'll be notified when we put out new videos. Today I have two separate videos for you, and we're going to conclude our Biology 101 series with evolution. This is lesson number 10. And so I put Charles Darwin on here because he is the father of evolution, and he did most of his work in the 1800s, so we put the 1859 up there. What he referred to evolution as was evolution by means of natural selection. So we're going to look at both of those processes, and that's how organisms change over time, and they change changes in their heritable physical or behavioral traits. So most of these would be traits that would be inherited. So let's look. Darwin was influenced by observations he made during his trip to the Galapagos Islands aboard the HMS Beagle. That was the name of the ship. HMS stands for Her Majesty's Service, in case you don't know. But what he did was he was a naturalist. He got seasick while he was on the ship. So he would get off of the ship and walk around the islands and keep notebooks where he drew pictures of different animals and he took notes about what he saw. So what he observed was a whole array of unique finches, and finches are birds, right? And they exhibit slight differences from island to island, and the differences he noticed most were beak shape. Depending on what they ate, if they ate seeds, they had one beak shape. If they ate nuts, they had another beak shape. If they ate worms, they had a different beak shape. So he was trying to figure out why they all had different beak shapes according to what they ate. So patterns in the distribution and similarity of organisms had a very powerful influence on Darwin's thinking. He also looked at tortoises and some other animals, lizards, giant lizards, and things that were on the Galapagos. But mostly when people talk about Darwin, it's the finches. So here's his theory. There are three different postulates. First, species, and I put the definition of a species here. Those are populations of interbreeding organisms. It can only be a species if they breed and produce viable young that can then in turn reproduce. So, and how those change over time and space. So the representatives of the species that live today are different than those that lived in the recent past, and those populations in different regions differ slightly in form or behavior. So when he thought of evolution, he thought over a long period of time, how are the species changing? And what do those changes mean? So number two is all organisms share a common ancestor with other organisms. And so he thought, this is what Darwin thought, over time populations may divide into different species, which share a common ancestral population. So those ancestors, that would explain the similarities of organisms that are classified together. When we mean classification, we're all human beings. We're all Homo sapiens. We're classified together. A dog is a canine, a cat is a feline. They belong, even though they're both vertebrates and animals, as we go down the taxonomy, we see that the farther you go down, the more closely related you are. We can belong to the same genus and a different species and exhibit different characteristics. And their similarities reflect the inheritance of the traits from a common ancestor. So what he's saying is you would not inherit these traits unless they were beneficial to you, and we'll look at that in the video on natural selection. Evolutionary change is gradual and slow. It doesn't happen overnight. So he thought that claim was supported by long episodes of very gradual change in organisms in the fossil record, and then the fact that no naturalist had observed the sudden appearance of a new species in Darwin's time. Not a new species just didn't pop up. So that was what he credited that to. The process of natural selection, according to Darwin, has 4 components. We're going to look at all 4 of them. The first one is variation, right? Organisms within populations have individual variation in appearance and behavior. So I put some examples down here. You see a dog, but not all dogs look the same. A collie looks different than a beagle, looks different than a cocker spaniel, right? Those are all dogs, those are all canines, but they're different species within the same population. So they can vary in body size, hair color, facial markings, how their voices sound, or number of offspring they produce. So that was the first thing, was variation. The second thing is inheritance. Some traits are consistently passed from parent to offspring, right? Those are called heritable, things that you inherit from your parents. Whereas other traits are strongly influenced by environmental conditions and show weak heritability, right? So this just depends on which of these characteristics or traits, genes, are more beneficial. Those are the ones that we're going to see. If they are only influenced by the environment, we may not see the heritability that we see in the ones that are not consistently. So, number 3, they have a higher rate of population growth. Most populations have offsprings each year that the resources can support, right? So that's one of the things that you learn, supply and demand. So we only have enough offspring that we have resources to feed them. If we have more, they're not going to survive, right? So leading to a struggle for resources. Each generation experiences substantial mortality, right? They die if there's no resources, right? So that's if you don't have anything to eat, then your species will die off, or the people will die off, or some of the animals will die off. Differential survival and reproductive rates. Individuals possessing traits well suited for the struggle for local resources will contribute more offspring to the next generation because they survive. Those attributes are then in turn passed on, and we'll look at that more when we look at natural selection. That would be like if you were out hunting and the guy that had the bow and arrow caught more than you did with your hands, right? Those are resources that we're talking about here. So natural selection, we have one generation to the next. That struggle for those resources will favor individuals with the variations that we talked about, over others, and then change the frequency of the traits within a population. If you have traits that are more beneficial, those are going to continue on, and they're going to occur more often because they're beneficial for the environmental conditions in which you live. They won't, that's the reason, that's what drives. The environment drives natural selection, and we'll look at that in the other video as well. They confer an advantage to those individuals who leave more offspring. That's called an adaptation. If you have a trait that is advantageous, then you adapt that to your environment. Those are called adaptations. That would be like Darwin and the beaks. You would have to possess the beak for what you're eating on that island. You can't have a beak for eating worms and eat seeds. You would starve to death. So you have to have the beak to eat seeds. Therefore, that's produced on. That's on in your offspring, right? You're no longer, and that's why on different islands they had different beak types because of different food sources. In order for natural selection to operate on a trait, the trait must possess heritable variation. Variation you can inherit, and it must confer an advantage to the competition for resources, or we don't need it. I used to tell all of my students when I taught biology is about 2 things, sex and food. Those are the 2 things, reproduction and what you eat. Those are the 2 things biology revolves around, because if you don't have either, your species ceases to exist. So evidence of natural selection, this is an example that people commonly use. It's called industrial melanism. Melanin is the pigment in your skin, or the pigment in a dog's fur or a cat's fur, or in this instance we're looking at moths, but melanin is pigment. They were peppered moths, and I gave you the genus and the species name. Anytime you see a genus name, you capitalize it. Species is lowercase, it's italicized or underlined. So they were called Beeston butillaria. Those are the peppered moths. So before 1800, the typical moth of this species looked light, like a really light gray to a white color, right? And very few of the dark colored melanic moths occurred. Those were very rare. Mostly you had the white moths, right? So if you're thinking about competition and predator-prey relationships, the white moths landed on the trees that had the most lichens. So lichens are, if you go and you're walking in the forest and you see that kind of stuff that looks like it's painted on the tree, it's green. A lichen is both a fungus and an alga. It photosynthesizes, but it also decomposes. But if you see more of those, that means that there is a lot of nutrients in the soil, a lot of oxygen. They call them lichen forests, and that's a good place to be. So these moths occurred on these trees to avoid predation. The birds couldn't see them to come pick them off, right? But during the Industrial Revolution, we had a lot of soot produced and other industrial waste that accumulated on the tree trunks, and it darkened the color of the tree trunks right here. So those light-colored moths became more rare, because now if you're a light colored moth against a dark tree trunk, the bird can see you, pick you off, and eat you. So they changed, and so the dark ones became more abundant because now they blend in more to the tree trunks than the light moths do. So by 1819, the first melanic morph was seen, and by 1886, it was far more common, illustrating rapid evolutionary change. The moths had to change rapidly to avoid being preyed upon. So eventually the light morphs were common only in a few locales, and those were far distances away from the industrial cities, right? The cause of this change was thought to be selective predation, right? We're picking the ones that we can see, the ones that the birds could see, and that favored the camouflage coloration of the moth. So this is the environment driving natural selection, or the heritable characteristics to continue on, which was one of Darwin's postulates. So if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and the next one is on natural selection, and if you watch it, it'll tie the two videos together. Thank you.